and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. It's no secret that cryptozoology is a field of study that has theories and hypotheses around every single corner you could possibly turn. Of course, this is because cryptozoology has to deal in hypotheticals most of the time. Because it's a field, essentially, about solving mysteries by nature being unsolved things, doors often have to be kept open for most, if not all, potential answers to said mysteries. The result of this is an abundance, perhaps even sometimes an overabundance, of hypothetical theories and ideas. There are a lot of prevailing and non-prevailing theories in cryptozoology, most of them pertaining to what a given cryptid, or, on a much wider spectrum, what cryptids themselves might be attributed to as a phenomenon. Are they all zoological? Are they paranormal? Perhaps is it even something psychological, something that we already have an explanation for, but just haven't made that much leeway with yet? Most of these theories are relatively self-explanatory. Everyone knows what someone means when they say cryptozoological. Although the range of definitions is wide, most people get an idea of what you mean when you say paranormal. However, the psychological theories are a bit more difficult to explain. Not because they're less likely, but because they would be one of the more complex ideas. Perhaps even more than paranormal roots, human psychology is a very difficult field to navigate because, quite frankly, human psychology is one of the most complex topics someone can actually discover and explore. That being said, this doesn't mean that the psychological theory of cryptids is one that shouldn't be explored. Rather, to understand the idea better and to get an idea of why perhaps it should be considered, it's very much worth exploring the idea. However, there's a particular branch of the psychological cryptid theory which is rather emergent at the moment that raises a lot of very interesting questions. Ones that haven't necessarily been asked before, but ones that have popped up in many other fields of study. Questions that, surprisingly, have many connections to cryptozoological or paranormal phenomenon. This is what might be called the archetypal cryptid theory. For those unfamiliar with the terminology being used here, this theory deals mostly in what are known as archetypes. Archetypes are essentially psychological ideas that are very commonly expressed throughout culture and across history. An example of an archetype might be the wise old man. As far back as the mythology of Merlin in the Dark Ages, a wizard who was an advisor to kings, to more contemporary examples, such as the mentor Ben Kenobi in the Star Wars franchise, wise old men can be found in essentially every single culture. They are prevalent throughout that culture's mythological stories, and they often persist from the beginning of those culture stories to the more modern stories as well. They exist across time and across culture. The idea of an archetype is that it is not simply a repeating idea. The importance of an archetype is that cultures who have had no contact with each other have similar ideas that are prevalent throughout those cultures. One perhaps more related to cryptozoology would be the wild man archetype. Essentially, every culture has some kind of wild man or man-animal in their mythology. Of course, it could be debated whether or not this is purely mythological or is a mythology based on real animals, but it is an idea expressed in most of the world's cultures. What's interesting is that much like the wise old man archetype, the wild man archetype also seems to express relatively the same ideas across many different cultures, often being a sort of dangerous but non-malicious guardian of the forest. Of course, there are some slight variations, but all in all, most cultures interpret the wild man as a strict protector of nature. having an understanding of what it means to examine an archetype, it might be clearer now what exactly the cryptid archetype theory is. The theory is that archetypes are so deeply ingrained into the mechanisms of human nature that perhaps under the right conditions, humans, for lack of a better term, experience archetypes to an extent that might even be referred to as an encounter. Whether or not it actually happened doesn't matter, because in this theory, the archetype is something that is mentally experienced and mentally experienced alone, but is so deeply ingrained in human nature that it might as well have been a real experience. Under the lens of the cryptid archetype theory, perhaps under the correct conditions, somebody witnesses what the human mind would refer to as the wild man archetype, and thus is convinced they've seen a Sasquatch. An example of this type of the cryptid archetype theory was proposed in 2016 by the University of Hertfordshire in the United Kingdom, in an article titled, "Our Collective Guilt is Leading to a Rise in Werewolf Sightings, Says Expert." This expert is Dr. Sam George, who argued that a rise in what many cryptozoologists would classify as dogman sightings might be attributed to mental phenomenon more than an actually physical phenomenon. In an elaboration of this idea, the article reads, Dr. George, who was behind the UK's first International Werewolf Conference at the University of Hertfordshire last year, says, "I often get asked what causes belief in werewolfism, but what is most pertinent and magical about this latest folk panic is that, quote, old stinker, unquote, is thought to inhabit a landscape which saw some of the last wolves in England. I argue that he represents not our belief in him as a supernatural shapeshifter, but our collective guilt at the extinction of an entire indigenous species, the last wolves." Along with the wild man archetype, werewolves are also prevalent across many, many cultures, and shapeshifters relating to wolves, which are a bit more broad than werewolves, of course, are prevalent in even more cultures. What Dr. George is suggesting is that the archetypal werewolf, often presented as a sort of nature-oriented trickster or vision of maliciousness, is being expressed by people who feel a certain connection, a guilty connection, to the idea of the wolf in this area in the world. Perhaps the idea might even be said to be that the maliciousness attributed to that guilt might be manifesting the mental image of man invading the wolf, resulting in the sort of trickster, untrustable image of man as a beast. It's important to note that, although perhaps interesting, Dr. George's conclusions are not peer-reviewed. That doesn't mean, however, that Dr. George is completely wrong. Of course, we can't answer a mystery with another mystery. To even know if the archetypal cryptid idea is something that can be supported scientifically, there are many questions that we would need to know first. Of course, what is an archetype is one of them that we can answer. A more important question, though, is if we are going to suggest that cryptids are, at least in part, something that is mental and expressed as an idea that is prevalent in the witness's culture or across the witness's species, in this case, wouldn't we need to know first that that can even happen? Are there actually cases documented of people who witness something that is not real, but nonetheless actually do witness it? A mental manifestation of archetypes. Can that actually happen? Although the latest words on this aren't peer-reviewed, it certainly isn't a new idea in psychology, and there are some documented cases. The most prevalent of which came from none other than psychologist Carl Jung, who could be argued to be the most influential psychologist who ever lived. A 20th century philosopher and psychologist, Carl Jung was known for his exploration of his own mental state, often resulting in deep psychological breakdowns, which somehow he found the fortitude to explore while having them over long periods of time, using them as a basis for his research on the human mind. Many of Jung's findings, so to speak, on his own mental state were not published until recently because they were, in fact, very controversial in the field of psychology. However, some of his letters and his books have been recently published that have addressed this idea, and one of them makes a very interesting note of what Carl Jung thinks of certain archetypes that he is documented as having encountered during his mental breakdowns. In a letter to a colleague from 1950, Carl Jung wrote, "Please forgive me for the long delay in answering your question. I have so much to do and such an enormous correspondence that I often cannot catch up with it with my limited resources. It can easily happen that a letter I would have most liked to answer is submerged for a long time in the flood of other, less important ones. It is, of course, extremely difficult in judging Gnostic images to tell how much is genuine inner experience and how much is philosophical superstructure. All the same, the enumeration of the many Nassan symbols for the one in Hippolytus shows with reasonable certainty that in many instances they are genuine primordial images. How far back the immediate experience behind these images lies, in other words, to what extent they are traditional, is another question. That they may be spontaneous experiences we know from our experience with patients, where any knowledge tradition must be definitely excluded. Thus, the pictures they occasionally draw are often spontaneous recreations of images which have a religious and historical significance. When Valentinus employs the word apoktine for the separation of the shadow, he may well have been thinking of the mythological usage for this word, for the separation of the shadow signifies the cutting off of the chthonic side. It does not seem exactly probable to me that when Christ cuts off his shadow, this is an immediate visionary experience, but chiefly a philosophical idea very drastically expressed. It is different with the image of the winged man. This is very much older than Phaedrus. It occurs, for instance, in Babylonia. Coming now to the egg, this egg or uterus is not restricted to the Greek sphere, but also occurs in India as Hiranyagarbha. Finally, the breaking of the vessels is a figure of speech which occurs practically everywhere. It need not be a primordial experience at all. I think very many symbols simply derive from language and linguistic metaphors. On the other hand, I think it is most unlikely that philosophy produces mythology. Philosophy can produce allegory, but not genuine mythology, since that is far older. It does, however, have affinities with philosophy through its budding philosophical ideas. These ideas are then worked out in philosophy. Their mythological aspect would amount to their involution, but this never leads to mythology, only to allegory. Philosophical interpretation and primordial image are always found side by side, as you quite rightly remark, for nothing promotes philosophical reflection as much as the experience of primordial images. This is also the case with dreams. When an unconscious content emerges into consciousness, it can effect this transition only by clothing itself with the ideas existing in consciousness, thereby becoming perceptible. As to how things look in the unconscious, that is beyond our ken. Hence, I define the archetypes as irrepresentable forms which clothe themselves with different material varying with each experience. The archetypal character of certain traditional images can probably never be established as due to an immediate primordial experience. One can conclude that the experience expressed an archetype only by demonstrating, through comparative research, that the same or very similar images occur in quite other cultures, and also as verifiable primordial experiences in modern individuals. The historical explanation of a symbol has therefore always to be sought first in its own cultural sphere, and then one must demonstrate the occurrence of the same or similar symbols in other cultural spheres in order to support the assertion that it is an archetype. But this assertion becomes absolutely certain only when the image can be found in a modern dream, and moreover in an individual who has never had any contact with those corresponding traditions. That, at any rate, is the procedure that I follow. Hoping I have answered your question, I remain. Yours very sincerely, Carl Jung. Of course, Carl Jung spoke in this very professional and verbose term, and it can be difficult to understand what exactly he meant, especially because this very verbose and complex terminology is being used to describe a very complex topic. Carl Jung was talking about how he interprets the images that certain psychological patients bring to him and other psychologists, often through drawings or descriptions of dreams. The debate was, Are these images things that these patients individually are thinking of and happen to find significant? Or does the fact that these images come up speak to the wider spread out of archetypes across the human population? Are these things the human mind tends to think of when encountering reality? Of course, we encounter reality in a narrative manner. We play out our lives like they're stories that we're the main characters of. We almost encounter reality, in that sense, in a fictional manner. So, are the patients thinking of individual fictional creations? Or are these archetypes being expressed that we express because they are intrinsic to our narrative way of interpreting reality? Carl Jung suggested, as we have discussed already, that some of these images are in fact individual, but that the ones that patients come up with, that they've had no exposure to, and yet that resemble ones created by many other cultures, are most certainly classifiable as archetypes. You'll note as well that he mentions a few images he finds to be interesting in that particular sense, one of which, perhaps the most prominent one, being the winged man. As it turns out, in his writing, Carl Jung notes that during one of his psychological breakdowns during the 20th century, he conversed with what he viewed as his own mental image of the archetypal winged man, which appeared to him as a human male with the wings of a kingfisher bird. The winged human can be found across almost every single culture, especially in the culture's art. In fact, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find a culture that doesn't have a story of winged men. There are other variations of winged creatures that all roughly mean similar things to winged men. Usually, winged men or winged creatures signify some kind of imminent event, either personally or outwardly. For instance, the Romans believed that owls were signifiers of death, while the Aztecs believed that the winged serpent was the bringer of great change. One of the most interesting cryptids in cryptozoology is the Mothman, or other winged humanoids, because often they are attributed to bad experiences. People don't react the same to seeing a Mothman or a winged humanoid that they do with some other mystery animals such as the Sasquatch or a lake monster. They often react very negatively and even experience trauma afterwards. There are also those who have noted that many winged humanoid sightings, more than a typical cryptid, seem to happen around areas that later on have some sort of tragedy take place within a pretty close time frame. The idea that the winged being carries tragedy or some kind of imminent change with it is one that is experienced throughout culture, and as Carl Jung himself noted, is one of the archetypes that can be experienced during a human psychological breakdown. Not only is the experience of archetypes real, but the experience of this particular archetype is documented by one of the most credible psychologists to ever live. This, of course, does not mean that every setting of winged humanoid is an archetypal experience, but the similarities are quite keen, and it makes one wonder, although perhaps the theory fails to explain all cryptid sightings, is it possible that some connections are a bit too strong to ignore? Are there cryptid sightings that can be attributed to the cryptid archetype theory? And if so, why do they happen? Under what conditions does someone see not a real wild man, not a real winged humanoid, not a real serpent, but an archetypal wild man, winged humanoid, or serpent? We know it happens. We don't know how often it happens. We don't know if someone needs to have a breakdown for it to happen. The theory, because of those things, doesn't hold that much water right now. It does point out, though, a very, very interesting phenomenon that should, perhaps, be taken into consideration when studying cryptozoological stories. It's a very complex topic, and it's kind of one that's hard to work out, so I would love to hear what all of you think of the cryptid archetype theory in the comments of this video. That being said, until next time.